Great innovation stories make change possible. Each week on the Innovation Storytellers podcast, I invite innovation leaders to share how they overcame the obstacles to introduce breakthrough ideas to the world through the power of story. I'm featuring guests from Tesla, TD Ameritrade, Corning, Cisco, Bloomberg, and so many more. Listen in to learn how you can tell a more effective innovation story and change the future for the better. Hey, everybody. I'm Susan Linder, your host of Innovation Storytellers, and I'm super excited today to have with me Diana Joseph from the Corporate Accelerator Forum. I wanted to have Diana on the podcast for a long time because this culmination of grown-ups and startups, of corporations and great ideas, and the way they come together is such a critical part of assembling an innovation portfolio and really creating a mindset around how do we think about bringing new ideas from the outside into an organization, and then how do we make the organization surrounded by a culture of innovation that can readily accept and process and use those ideas on a day-to-day basis. So let me give you a little bit of background about Diana before we dive in. So Diana believes that everyone needs to be more entrepreneurial. Hear, hear. A former high-tech innovation director with a doctorate in learning sciences, Diana brings together techniques from motivation psychology, education, Silicon Valley innovation methods, things like design thinking and lean startup, right? All of those concepts that we talk about so often here on the podcast. And Diana's consultancy helps individuals and organizations become more innovative and entrepreneurial by balancing compliance-based and initiative-based work, which we can't have one without the other, right? None of us are innovating without constraints. So some of Diana's clients include Applied Materials, the Alchemy Accelerator, right? Kaufman Fellowship, the World Innovation Lab, Tokyo Marine, and Activate. Great organizations. So while we're talking, feel free to take a look at corporateacceleratorforum.com and check that out. And there you'll see some of the tools and practices and stories and relationships that corporates need to unlock open innovation, which a favorite topic of ours here on the show as well. So let's dive in. Diana, thank you so much for joining us on Innovation Storytellers. I hope I pronounced all of those things right.
We'll fix them as we go if we need to.
There you go. So let's get started. How did you even get into innovation? Because nobody gets here, directly. So tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So you mentioned that I'm a learning scientist by training.
Yes.
And in my academic work, there were sort of two big themes that were really important to me. One is self-determination. I worked a lot on motivation and learning. I was thinking mainly in the learning context, but you can kind of see how that idea of motivation comes up again in the idea that everybody needs to be more entrepreneurial. Self-determination and being entrepreneurial go really closely together. And the other theme was around how do you do research in the real world? Social science methods tend to be very structured. You're working in a lab type setting, you're doing a survey, something like that. But the actual real world is changing under you as you go. And so to do an intervention in the real world and see how that changes is kind of a new way of doing social science. And so after being in academia for some time, I moved into the corporate world. I was working at Adobe, and I got exposed to their internal innovation program there. It's called Kickbox. Have you talked about Kickbox on the podcast?
We have not.
Okay, I'll help you figure out how to do that. So Kickbox is a program that was developed by Adobe's chief creativity officer.
Who doesn't want that title?
Maybe VP of creativity. Anyway, creativity is in there exactly. It's like the best title in the world. His name is Mark Randall, and he developed this program based on lean startup as the methodology, but also bringing in his experience as an entrepreneur, and his charisma as an entrepreneur, and all of his stories. And his stories were so important. So there was a boot camp that you would go through for Kickbox, and then you would get this red box at the end of the boot camp. And inside the box were all the tools that you need for innovation. You got your sticky notes, you got your Sharpies, you got your little bad ideas notebook with a picture of a little dog pooping on the front of it. You got a timer, like all kinds of like apparatus like that. And also a credit card, prepaid credit card with $1,000 on it. And that was mind blowing because nobody had ever offered me resources before. I didn't have a budget. My boss didn't have a budget. My boss's boss didn't have a budget. You basically had to be 2 levels down from the board to have actual discretionary budget. Now, look, $1,000, that was a really good job. And I definitely had $1,000 of my own money that I could have spent, but it never would have occurred to me to spend my own money an idea that might serve my company and would belong to my company. Like that was just, it just never would have crossed my mind. So this gesture of trust, this gesture of like, here's some budget, go do what you think is interesting, you be the leader, was really powerful. And it resonated so much with what I had been thinking about self-determination and motivation from my academic work. And then also on top of that, the lean startup methodology resonated with that practice of doing an intervention in the world and learning from it. And so I got really, really inspired and I wanted to go work for Mark. And I was like, hey, I'm exactly the right person. Let me help you do this. And he's like, do you not understand what lean means in lean startup? He's like, I have a quarter of an admin and that is just fine. I was like, oh. So I got the opportunity then, following a graduate school colleague, I got the opportunity to go to Citrix and run their innovation enablement program, teaching design thinking around the company. So that's when I got to go to D-School boot camp and really get infused with those methods on top of the learning sciences, the design-based research, the lean startup. And so all that started to form some sort of alchemy.
You know what's fascinating about that too is that here's the $1,000, go do it.
Yeah.
It wasn't the think about it, create a study about it, right? It was just go effing do it.
Yeah.
And there's so much, we talk about it so often on this program, is how much hesitancy there is to it.
Yeah.
And it's not only a gift in terms of faith, right? That you can go and do this. And I have trust that you'll spend it wisely, as opposed to going to Neiman Marcus or needless markup and going to find a really great bag for yourself. Like, fantastic. But the other side of that is to say, I fully trust you.
Yes.
And I want you to experiment and potentially even want you to fail. I mean, and that contributing back to the innovation culture at Adobe is probably just as important as whatever the outcome of that $1,000 experiment or that $1,000 idea you might have.
Yes, it completely changed the relationship that I had with the company. The company is saying, you're a leader. We know you are. If this turns out interesting, let us know. So we didn't even have to come back. We didn't even have to say, here's what I did. Let me prove that my time was well spent. It was just like, of course your time will be well spent. Why would we put administrative effort into documenting whether your time is well spent? Obviously your time is well spent. And that type of trust just really opened a door.
So out of curiosity, what did you spend it on?
So my idea was connected with Photoshop, and there's a dresser right behind me right now that is full of children's art. And that's what the inspiration was. My children were small at the time. And like, what am I going to do with all this stuff that they're producing? Like, I think it's amazing because it's my kid, but like, am I going to keep this piece of paper with this image on it? Really? Like, I'm going to store this? So the idea was that there would be a really, really easy way to get that art into a frame, and the frame would show you images in a way that made sense. Like sometimes it would connect you on the color. Sometimes it would connect you on where the image came from. Sometimes there were photographs that would connect on who, and so that it could do different thematic things, and it would just sit there on your wall being this very intimate piece.
I'm a mom. I would have loved that.
They told us, like, you can spend it on anything. Really, the company's going to be uncomfortable if you spend it on alcohol. And I was like, well, obviously what I need to do is a focus group with the other moms in my community, and we'll have beer. Like, and I was like, I think I checked, and I think I really should. The gesture was to not check, like, just go do that. So I think I checked, and it was like, yeah. So anyway, I may be now going to get in trouble in retrospect for buying beer for the other moms, but yeah,
mom will thank you.
I could tell that it was a real idea.
Yeah.
The problem was I got more interested in the innovation stuff than I was in owning and pursuing that idea. So I think it could have been really interesting. So I bequeathed it to someone else inside the organization. Maybe it went somewhere, I don't know.
So you skipped ahead to Citrix, and then how did the Corporate Accelerator Forum come to being? Because you've been doing this since 2017. How did that come to be?
So while I was at Citrix, as I mentioned, I added design thinking to the quiver. So design thinking, lean startup, a little bit of agile, this research method called design-based research that I helped to develop way back before. So I felt that I had this nice toolkit. We built a curriculum for seed startup program called the Innovators program that we ran in Santa Clara, Fort Lauderdale, Santa Barbara, Raleigh, Bangalore, many times. So we really, really refined the curriculum, and we felt like we could see how it had impact on both the external startups and the internal teams that were part of it. We built an internal version of it for customer facing teams that weren't necessarily working on product, and learned a ton doing that. And then Citrix was taken over by a hedge fund. We talked about signals at some point. There were signals that something was going to happen, and I started to think about what's next. And also, I caught the bug working with these startups. That's where I started to use the word entrepreneurial. I'd been talking about motivation and learning and self-determination and innovation all the way along, but the idea of being entrepreneurial was a new frame for me, and a really helpful frame, because it put some clarity on what a person is supposed to do. You're going to go and take an idea forward. And I had never really done that before. To be fair, academia is extremely entrepreneurial. Professors have to figure out what path they're going to take, and they have to pursue that independently. But I had never, right, and get funding for it. But it's a very specific format. And so the idea, this phrase that you mentioned before, everybody has to be more entrepreneurial, became a vision that I could sign on to. And thank goodness lots and lots of people, including you, are part of this very giant vision. So I thought, okay, if I really think that everybody has to be more entrepreneurial, I'd better explore that myself. So I'd better do something that's really clearly entrepreneurial. I'd better have these experiences so that I'm not just teaching them without knowing what it's like. I need my own, to your point about stories, I need my own field stories about these experiences, including successes and failures. So I started to look for, okay, well, that's a really big vision. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to make everybody more entrepreneurial. Let me find a mission within that. And I started exploring lots of different things. So again, I went back to the moms from the parents from my kids' school, the parents who had, specifically those who had been at home, and now the children were getting old enough, they need to think about going back into the workforce. And so I explored that as one possible way. Who am I going to help be more entrepreneurial, and how am I going to help them? So that's a real exploration. I still do some career strategy consulting. The one that really resonated was working with corporates. And that came about through, I got the opportunity. I should mention that the person that I followed to Citrix was Julie Baher, my grad school colleague. And I now call her my chief introduction officer. And one of the people that she introduced me to at this time when I was exploring was the kind of head scientist at Illumina Accelerator. And she introduced me to Amanda Cashin, who was the head of Illumina Accelerator at the time. She's now the global head of Illumina for startups. They've grown and expanded. I like to think that we had something to do with that. But where it started is that I wanted to interview Amanda. I was thinking of it as a customer discovery interview in kind of classic lean fashion. And my plan, you're not supposed to do this in the customer discovery interview, by the way. My plan was that I would interview her, and it would be apparent that she needed curriculum, which I already had. And then I would get to sell her the curriculum. So great idea, right? But you're supposed to be listening for the need, right? And in the meeting, it turned out that she was just as eager to interview me as I was to interview her, because she had heard about what had happened at the Citrix Startup Accelerator. It just wasn't there anymore. And the design was quite similar to what she was doing at Illumina Accelerator, very kind of traditional formal accelerator with equity and a cohort and all that sort of thing. And the Citrix Startup Accelerator was gone. So what happened? So really, it wasn't her answers to my interview questions that helped me see the need. It was her questions to me that helped me see the need. She wanted to understand what the heck happened. over there. And that's what exposed us to this idea that, like, you know what, nobody's really communicating with this industry. Nobody's creating a way for people in startup accelerators per se to understand the big picture.
What was the need when you first got started? And you're like, I often tell clients, like, where is the customer bleeding from the neck? This is a very New York way of looking at a problem. But where did you think the agony was in the market?
So starting from that question, this is an approach to innovation that's very intimate. It starts with a real person who is metaphorically and extremely bleeding from the neck, right? Mm-hmm. So Amanda was like, what happened over there? I don't have any insight into the trends that are coming for people in my industry, that are coming for organizations in this, doing this practice of startup innovation. I cannot make sense of the world standing where I am. And so from there, we started to explore with other organizations, and we could see, you could kind of see, we would talk about this and the eyes would dilate and you could see physical manifestation of emotion. So you're like, that person is secretly bleeding from the neck on this one too. And then
what were those issues? What were the bleeding from the neck issues?
So how do we do this? How are other people finding their startups? How are other people what is actually the process on the ground? What happens? What does the recruiting process look like? What are the activities that the startups are participating in throughout? What does demo day look like? Who's there? Everybody's building this from scratch, and everybody's starting with the Y Combinator model. There's nothing wrong with the Y Combinator model, but it doesn't fit perfectly into a corporate setting. And so everyone has to revisit exactly what they're going to do, how it's going to fit into strategy, how they're going to communicate internally.
So let's talk about that Y Combinator model, because a lot of people, we have a big international audience, and some people aren't familiar.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So Y Combinator is a very famous accelerator. I don't know my history well enough to know if it was the first one, but it's a very prominent one that is connected with a lot of very, very famous startups. They've been part of the journey for many very famous startups. Mm-hmm. And they have a specific model that they use where they take a certain amount of equity in return for a certain amount of money. So funding side of Y Combinator will provide some money to the startup, in return for which the startup will allow Y Combinator to own a part of the startup. So, and then there's access to a great deal of information. There are talks and mentoring, and the idea is that everyone's very aligned because we all own the company together. The accelerator and the startup are very much aligned, and we'll put all of our effort together into the success of the startup. So corporates like Illumina and like Citrix adopted the same format. So they would recruit startups, provide funding in return for equity, build some kind of program around it. And the idea behind Y Combinator is that startup will become a unicorn, we'll all make tons of money. In corporate, it's more complex than that because there's already a business. And so you have to figure out how the startup is going to interact with that business, what lessons, there can be enormous value in the lessons learned. It's not just the dollar amounts. And so it wasn't a bad idea to start there, but there's complexity in any given organization. And they really needed to understand together by hearing each other's stories about what was working and what wasn't working.
And that storytelling among startups and the story between the corporate and the startup is so critical. And I think oftentimes I have so many questions that are bubbling up while we're talking about this. So many times when I give a talk at a big conference, it's always large corporate representatives who come up to me and said, how do I get my giant company thinking like that? Like the way that you talk about startups think.
Right.
And it's kind of like, well, we can't, but what we can do is we can talk about intrapreneurship. And I'm wondering how you see the difference between creating an entrepreneurship mindset inside a large company versus intrapreneurship and battling the demons that exist on the corporate side, and also the wealth of resources that exist on the corporate side that startups don't have the benefit of dealing with. What's the juxtaposition between entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship?
That's a lovely question. I'm going to take us back to something that you talk about a lot, which is the culture. I think we can pay more attention to the structure behind corporate culture. When you say we can't, there are real reasons why we can't, right? A corporation is a very aligned organization. The way the incentives work inside the organization, the way reporting works by law, the way that the hierarchy works, all of these elements operate to maximize alignment. And there's nothing wrong with maximizing alignment. There are very, very good reasons to do that. And what you do is you create this very, very strong structure that is also brittle, right? Mm-hmm. Often strength and brittleness go together, right? So when a big new wave is coming, that can really, you and I have talked before about Airbnb and Hilton. So a big new wave comes and it's super, super difficult for the established incumbent to be flexible and change with that big new wave. And so entrepreneurship, so to take it back to entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship, an entrepreneur outside the organization doesn't have any of that hierarchy, doesn't have any of that structure, doesn't have any of that alignment. To your point, doesn't have any resources, but also doesn't have any process in the way of getting to resources. So they have more flexibility about how to reach different kinds of resources, more flexibility about how to change their minds about what they're doing, more flexibility about who does what, how people get rewarded. And that's what corporates are really attracted to. They want that kind of movement. My argument is if that's specifically what you're looking for, do that through partnership with startups. Let them do that movement, take that type of risk that's not appropriate inside the aligned organization. And you can get the benefit of the ideas, and you can also get influence on the mindsets. But until you can change those structures, you're not going to get that kind of activity. Well, let's go back to the idea of the Kickbox program, right? So with Kickbox, the corporate was offering this level of trust and, to your point, this level of interest in failure, not just like it's okay to fail, but like, please go fail with this and let us know what you learned.
Right, which is huge.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And maybe the ideas may or may not actually make any difference, but you get the energy, you get the lessons, you've created a pocket in which people can put their innovation energy and in which that energy can be received without dismantling the strong alignment that you really need for other reasons. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, because it's kind of like a skill set almost, right? To be an entrepreneur, like some would say, are the qualities of innovator, rebel, like someone who is assertive in getting their ideas to the finish line. All of those things feel like they exist on the entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurship side. Like I will die on the hill for this innovation. Mm-hmm. By the same token, that innovator, that entrepreneur rather, mm-hmm. needs to be a little bit more savvy about how to navigate not the whole market, but also to navigate the internal machinations of the company that they work with. So how do I deal with the political issues? How do I deal with the people issues, the scaling issues, the regulatory issues, and then the endless agonizing process? I mean, we've had entrepreneurs on the show who say, my company eats startups and destroys them. Because we crush them under the weight of ourselves.
Yeah. So I want to bite into a few things there. One is around, I have so many ideas trying to escape my mouth all at the same time. So in our very first year, when we did our very first meeting, bringing corporates together to like learn about what's causing all this bleeding from the neck, right? To learn about the things that are making it so hard for each of these individual companies to do it, to interact with startups. We came across this idea that we call the frozen organization. And it comes in two flavors. There's the top-down flavor, meaning that the senior leadership believes in the cash cow. Everything's going to be fine. What do you mean Airbnb? Everything's going to be fine. There may be a lot of enthusiasm in the middle and in the front lines of the organization for change, but there's no support at the top. That's a little more rare. The more common variety of it is the frozen middle. And in that context, the senior leaders have many good words to say about wanting to foster innovation in the organization. It applies to whether you're working with startups or whether it's internal, right? The senior leaders have many good things to say about innovation and maybe even are putting some resources toward it. The front line can be super, super enthusiastic, but in the middle, nothing changes. And the managers won't move. And there's a tendency for people on the front lines to get really annoyed with the managers or with peers for not moving, that describing it as a mindset issue. But in fact, it comes back to culture and structure. It comes back to structure, really, right? So those middle managers are incentivized to do certain very specific things. Some of them are determined by law. Some of them are how folks are incentivized. The idea of breaking off time or money or FTE to work on an innovation takes away from something that they've promised. And it's very, very, very hard for them to move. So I think that's what you're looking at when you talk about entrepreneurs struggling with their internal stakeholders, especially that middle management layer. And what it takes is using kind of the same innovation communication that we do, right? So I talked about interviewing Amanda Cashin at Illumina. What if people did that same kind of interview with their internal stakeholders? We actually have a canvas that we've built. It's inspired by the business model canvas. It's designed for corporate internal stakeholders to talk to each other about strategy. What are we doing for customers? What are we agreed on about what we're trying to accomplish for customers? What we're trying to accomplish financially? What are we agreed on about what we're going to do about learning? What kind of resources we're going to put in? It's really quite simple. You can have a conversation on the back of a napkin, but I think those conversations get skipped a lot. And so having those alignment conversations from the beginning, here's what we've agreed on in principle. Then when the real specific request comes in, it's in a context and it's much easier for folks to respond to.
Hey, it's Susan here. Like what you're hearing so far? Make sure you never miss an episode by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. So thank you for being here. Whether it's your first time or you're 10 episodes deep, if you want to learn more about me and the work that I do with innovation leaders, head over to susanlindner.com for more information. I'm always open to a conversation to learn how I might better support you. But for right now, let's get back to the show.
It's fascinating. So the work that you do then, and do you refer to it as CAF, or how do you?
Sure, you can refer to it as CAF. That's fine.
Yeah. So I have an image when I say it of like a golden calf or
I need to think of an L.
That's right.
Burning Forum.
Because it is your baby, right? And so
it's great. I love that.
So yeah, just thinking about that. So tell us a little bit about the process and how it works and how you become this bridge between the corporates and the startups.
The reality is we're more of a bridge between the corporates per se, helping them together get better at working with startups. I'll give you a little bit of the pathway because we are going to get more into that practical work of connecting them with startups in this coming year. So we started out with a single meeting in 2017. Now we call it our first annual meeting, but of course we didn't know it was annual at the time. We were just bringing together corporate leaders who were trying to work with startups and finding it really, really difficult and not finding anyone to talk to about it, not finding any place. There's no Bible for it. There's no community for it. And so we brought them together and it was really, people found it really compelling. I used every learning sciences trick that I have to design a very, very interactive experience with lots of visuals, lots of a very concrete way to take the lessons home. And people found it very compelling. And so we did it again the following year. And then we could see more of the specific things that people needed. And we created a membership program that came with some workshops around metrics and storytelling, for example, and how those two things go together. We started to create ecosystem experiences. So for specific regions or specific industries that were grappling with multi-stakeholder challenges around their startup engagement, we could come in and create a really rich experience that generated the lessons that they needed to learn and an action plan. And there have been themes that have arisen each year that have helped to shape what we do. We're really, really listening to our members and to the world to see kind of what needs to happen next. So that first year, it was the frozen organization, and we better get clear about metrics and storytelling and alignment. The canvas kind of emerged from that. Then there was this idea of ecosystems. And so we created these ecosystem experiences. I wrote a paper with Susan Wyndham-Bannister, who was the founding CEO of the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center, and really responsible for translating $1 billion from the state legislature into making Cambridge and Boston a life sciences hub. We wrote a paper articulating her framework and talking about why corporates need to be part of that kind of ecosystem. So ecosystems has been a huge theme the last couple of years. And then this year, we're really getting very concrete about, and this is something that we've been talking about throughout this conversation, about process and about the actual deals with the actual startups. And we really feel like that goes hand in hand. We're hearing from corporate leaders who work with startups that they are finding really interesting startups, and they're getting enthusiastic about deals on both sides. And then once it comes into the corporate process, it dies. So we're collaborating closely with an organization called the Peace Innovation Institute in The Hague, and they have a very interactive, creative deal-making process. And we're going to be pairing that with an experience where we'll bring corporates together to learn from each other and model for each other how to develop processes that are conducive to these fast-moving things. We're really focused on the startup side, but I think the same thing is really necessary for entrepreneurship. The processes that apply typically we need to have special ones for innovation.
So tell us something that you know as a result of having a PhD in learning sciences that the rest of us don't know when it comes to doing great entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship. Like, what do we need to be learning that we just leave by the wayside and think it's not critical? Or, what are we missing?
Learning that sticks is learning by doing.
Learning that sticks is learning by doing. So it's not writing, it's not listening, it's in the doing.
Not that you shouldn't write, not that you shouldn't listen. Writing, I think of as a category of doing, but listening and reading are insufficient. They're insufficient both because the specifics of your particular spot in the world are different from whatever you read about. That's theory. And in practice, it's going to be different. But also just cognitively, it's different. What we do in the mind when we're the ones pushing on the world is different from what we do when we're just passively taking in ideas.
That makes sense.
That's a crucial one that's specifically from the learning sciences. I think learning is social is another one. This is not a solo endeavor. And you can apply that both to, like, if you're a single entrepreneur working by yourself, it's going to be really hard. And then it also applies to the organization itself. If you're trying to do innovation inside a corporate without reaching past the walls into the outside world, it's going to be really difficult, and you're going to make the wrong kinds of mistakes.
So as you look we're in 2022 now, right? We're going through this COVID never-endingness. What are the ways that we need to be more brilliant, frankly, at innovating during this time frame where everything's in flux? Like, we don't have the luxury of anymore of saying, like, oh, we're just hitting the status quo. If we could have convinced ourselves that there was a status quo before, that's out the flipping window, right?
That's right. I hope so. I hope we're there, right? There were a lot of us in this industry who knew how important it was to be ready for change at any time. Hopefully everyone recognized it now. I don't know. How do we be more brilliant? I think part of it has to do with humility. Like, you don't have to win every time. The point is not whether you get a win on the particular project. It's important to strive for the win, but what you're getting out of that is the learning. And what you're guaranteed by doing the doing is the learning. And then also, I think that there's an assumption that the initial work has to be huge. Like, we do want to create businesses that are huge, but we can start really small. And so we can create carve-outs. If you're trying to invest $100 million in innovation, that might be too much. That's going to hit the attention of the CFO. It's going to hit the attention of Wall Street. It's going to feel too important and you won't be willing to fail. What is the smallest amount of money? What is the smallest amount of attention that you can draw to do this exploration and really learn something? And that's where I think if you want to get past innovation theater, it's okay to do something that's small.
It's okay to do something that's small, going back to your $1,000 idea, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So give us an example, like having this forum now and working with so many different corporate innovators. What are some examples of going small that really track or that really work? Or that you've seen, just to get our own brains thinking, especially during this time, about what could we even be trying right now?
Yeah. I think one-off proof of concept projects. Maybe you don't need a full-scale venture studio yet. Maybe you don't need a full-scale accelerator yet. Maybe you do a proof of concept with one company that's doing something interesting within the adjacent possible. Maybe if you're working on the entrepreneurship side, maybe it's kickbox, right? You can give away a lot of $1,000 without impacting your bottom line in any meaningful way.
That's true. You certainly could.
Right? Maybe it's participation in the ecosystem in some other way. Maybe you're just putting in people's incentives that they need to go out to startup events and meet people. Maybe it's investment training. There are lots of ways to engage with the ecosystem that don't involve risking the whole show. And that's where you start. You do need to be ready to risk the whole show eventually, but it doesn't make sense to start there. And that's what scares everybody.
So are there some basics? Here's what needs to be assembled in order to get going.
So I'll give you basics that are specific to engaging with startups. And having done this for 5 years, we understand enough, and we're actually working on a book now. So this is how I understand it today, and I'm sure it'll evolve through the writing, which I count as a piece of doing. It's the synthesis piece of doing, right? So the first piece is that alignment. Have the conversation. We can put a link to the paper about the innovation dashboard canvas if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The first thing is have that alignment conversation. What do we all agreed is the vision? What do we all agreed is the mission? What do we all agreed is the strategy in terms of customers, the strategy in terms of money? What do we agreed on in specific tactical categories? We're good at alignment in the corporate world. So let's get that going first. And then let's create a carve out of process so that we can actually make a deal quickly. Maybe we get to work with a single lawyer instead of going through the typical procurement process. What are we going to do so that we can do that first experiment? And then just get into it. Think about what it is that you want to learn, be ready to learn things that you didn't know that you were going to learn, and think about what the goals are. And then the leaders hold the space of we're just here to learn. And whoever's driving that project holds the space of we're going to try to make this project win as hard as we possibly can. Whether it wins or not is a different question, but we're going to try.
So what's the ultimate outcome when large companies come to you, are they looking for incremental innovation? Are they looking for a new opportunity, or are they looking for a moonshot?
That's a great question. And it's actually, there are more dimensions than that even. So for example, Illumina for startups, they are accelerating not their potential acquisitions, but their customers. So they're using engagement with these startups that are their customers to help them understand their market and to get ahead, like who's doing the latest stuff, our field of genomics. What can that tell us about what we need to be prepared for? Right. And then another example is Eastman. So Eastman has gone all in on molecular recycling, which means that they can take a piece of plastic, unzip the molecules, and put them back together as virgin plastic. So the quality of the recycled plastic that comes out of a process like that is virgin quality plastic. It's very difficult. There's all kinds of opportunity for both internal and external innovation on that. And it does have the potential to really shift the business in the long run. We're going to stop pulling hydrocarbons out of the ground and we're going to start using only this recycled stuff. Right? So that's a huge one. There are others where it's part of staying informed in the science. So we're a materials company, and there's somebody using quantum computing to identify new molecules. We're going to learn something about the quantum computing. We're going to maybe learn something about the new molecules. Are we going to shift our entire business around that? Maybe not. So there's a lot of diversity in what the big corporates are looking for. And I think anytime that you're reaching outside the organization, you're spreading and diversifying your footprint so that you're more flexible when inevitably a big change comes at you.
When disruption happens. Yeah. Well, I have a couple of questions for you. We always do these hot seat questions at the end of our conversations together. So having been you have a PhD in learning sciences, so you probably have a very unique perspective on some of the ways that we've innovated over the course of human history and what we've learned. So one of the questions I always like to ask guests, if you could be part of any innovation team, throughout history, what innovation team would you have loved to have been on?
Oh, you and I are recording here on Martin Luther King Day.
We are.
And that is the innovation team that I would most have loved to be on, and that I aspire to be on still.
Wow.
Think about the change that those people achieved. Think about the coordination between the innovators, the experiments that they did, the risks that they took. I'm feeling it.
Wow.
Yeah.
No one's ever said a social movement as part of an innovation team before on this show. So I'm very grateful for you to add that in, because innovating society is probably the most important innovation that we could all be working on. So Thank you for including that. So that said, to you, what is the most important innovation that interacts with your life every day? What innovation do you marvel at still?
Oh, so many, but one that I really want to talk about. There's a lot of language right now, and this is going to make the podcast dated because something's going to change. But there's a lot of conversation about the metaverse, right?
Yes,
right at this moment. And when we went on lockdown, I mentioned I use all my learning sciences tricks to create these in-person experiences, and we went on lockdown. So what the heck are we going to do, right? So that happened in March. We had an annual meeting planned in October. A lot of people were like, "Oh, it'll be fine by then," and I was like,
"Right."
I have a background in human biology, and I was like, "I am thinking about this stuff," and I'm like, "We are not going to be back. So what are we going to do? Because I don't know how to apply these learning sciences tricks in the context of Zoom. I can think about workarounds, but this like Brady Bunch layout is not conducive to the kinds of choice making that I need to have in these experiences." So I looked and looked and looked and looked, and I found in a little tiny column in Wired magazine a story about a company. I can't even remember what its name was at the time. It changed. It's now called GatherTown. So I chased them down somehow because they were already changing. I needed the tools that they had. So Gather.town is a platform that allows two things that are really important to me, and some other stuff that's important to other people. The two things that are important to me are, first of all, that I can design the space. So in the same way that I might walk into a room at Corning and put up posters and close or open doors in order to control the space, I have even more control in GatherTown. I can make whatever little rooms I want. I can make walls passable or not passable. I can create a world. And the other really important feature is proximity. So we have avatars in GatherTown. We also see each other like this in video. But we have avatars, and we can move the avatars around. And when our avatars are close to each other, we can hear and see each other really well. And when our avatars are far away from each other, we can't. And so what that means is that if we're in a big crowd, but you and I just had some chemistry and we need to have a side conversation, we can just say, "Hey," we can chat each other even. "Let's pull over into the big easy chairs over on the right of our screen, and you and I will just have our own private conversation." So people can control in that way. I can also send people into breakout rooms, and then they can choose whether they actually want to be there or not. They can choose which one to go to, and they can move their avatar to get to a different one. And that was my first glimpse of the metaverse. We didn't have the word metaverse. And it's not a fancy VR, AR version of it, but we can come into the world in a way that I find really important, that I find really powerful in doing what I do. So that's my favorite these days.
Wow. And it sounds like such an amazing way to, apply constraint to an innovation problem too, but with people at its center, which is really interesting.
Yes, they are brilliant for that. The team is brilliant for that. They are very, very careful to stay humane.
And what do you think about what's next in terms of, is there an innovation that you wish somebody would invent?
Virus zapper.
Yeah, right. For sure. Anything cyber related would be great.
What's the innovation that I'm most hungry for right now? That's a great question. One challenge that I have as an entrepreneur is I'm a little bit comfortable with good enough. I tend not to bleed from the neck. And so I have to work hard to find those places where I'm bleeding from the neck. I'm pretty comfortable and satisfied. I'm very, very lucky. So what am I really on fire for? I want to feel safe from these big things. I want to feel safe from climate change. These are huge things. So it's going to take movements to do these things. But yeah, I want to feel like we're all going to be okay. That's what I'm hungry for.
Yeah, peace of mind.
Can I give you a more shallow one too?
Yeah, of course. Sure.
I want an appearance pod. So I'm going to get up in the morning. I'm going to step into this pod and then I'm going to step out of it. And my hair is going to be amazing. and I'm going to have just the right outfit. That's my superficial one.
Well, like Zoom now has these, you could apply eyebrows and you could apply lipstick and stuff like that, which is my favorite things to do. I don't have it on today, but typically I bring my mug up to my mouth and then there's lipstick on this side of your mug. It's really fantastic, but I agree with you. Yes. Certainly a help from the online dating world for sure. It kind of like takes your Instagram filter and carries it around with you wherever you go in the virtual world. Well, Diana, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited and thrilled by this conversation. And I really hope that it's shed a light for a lot of our corporate intrapreneurs on how to think a little bit more like an entrepreneur and to know that those opportunities are available to them. So how can people get in touch with you, Diana?
So I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, and we'll make sure that the link is there as well. You can also reach us through the website, corporateacceleratorforum.com.
Fantastic. Well, wonderful. And we'll put that all in the show notes. Thank you so much, Diana.
My pleasure.
Now you might be asking, Susan, why innovation storytelling? Well, the truth is that an innovation story told well not only breaks down communication barriers so you can drive change and new growth, but it also helps other people remember and champion your work. And it propels your best ideas forward faster to secure you the runway, resources, and recognition you so richly deserve. In other words, stories are memory-making devices that significantly reduce the time it takes for you and your innovation to be understood. But like many leaders, you probably never got the memo that storytelling skills would be central to your success. Well, I've got some good news for you. It's not too late because I've got you covered. Whether you need an expert to come and speak to your innovation leaders, you need training in the art and method of innovation storytelling, or you just need the support and guidance of a consultant who can get you where you want to go in less time, visit www.susanlinder.com today to learn more and to set up a call to discuss your needs. I'm so looking forward to connecting with you and to helping you tell a great innovation story. If you liked what you heard so far, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another episode. And leave us a comment. Tell us what you think of this episode. We'd love to hear from you. And if you didn't like what you've heard, just forget everything I've said.